ignorant, but getting everything set up for streaming, doing the recording, doing the podcast stuff has been a steep learning curve for me. But I got it figured out now, so we're good.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear it. It's foreign to me. I've been on a few, but I'll do my best.
That's all right, Mark. We're going to turn you into an internet star, so don't worry about it. Oh, boy. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And this is kind of a bittersweet thing for me. I moved from Ohio to Colorado in 2019. And I've had to learn a completely different style of hunting, and it's driving me crazy. So it might be a little refreshing to talk to someone that may bring me some familiarity back a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I can't imagine that Colorado has been disappointing for you.
Oh, no. So last year was my first year big game hunting. I did archery mule deer. And while I wasn't successful, I saw more deer than I ever did back in Ohio. I also got closer to them, and I learned a lot of important lessons. Most of which is that I need to buy a rifle, and then I'll be successful.
Yes.
So, but I've been a hunter my whole life. So transitioning from Ohio to here, the only real difference is just dealing with the different game animals and terrain. Basic principles are the same.
Yeah, certainly.
I assume, did you grow up in Ohio?
I did, yeah. Central Ohio, a farm kid. So spent a lot of time outdoors. Kind of where I cut my teeth hunting was squirrels and rabbits. I kind of missed the game bird golden years in Ohio. And even wild turkey in my part of the state were a late, or I should say recent arrival. My county specifically, it was uncommon to see wild turkey even a little more than a decade ago. We were still, the Division of Wildlife, which I wasn't with the division then, was still translocating turkey to my home county in the early 2000s. So those efforts were still ongoing when I was doing a lot of hunting in my part of the state.
That's interesting, because whenever I think of Ohio, I assume turkey are everywhere. Digressing a minute back to the game birds, and I know I was from Southern Ohio, so I was in Scioto County. Yep. We didn't have a whole lot of game birds other than turkey. I jumped a grouse once, but that was only one time. I know when you get farther north, there were pheasant and quail, right?
You're right. Yes. So those species, maybe excluding grouse, so talking specifically pheasants and quail, were far more widespread through the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. Their ranges now we still have those wild populations of those birds, but they're more regional. If you're in the wrong part of the state, you simply aren't going to find them, even in good cover. Grouse, they've sort of always been in that unglaciated southern half of Ohio and eastern half of Ohio, at least in the most recent century. And then Scioto County actually was a stronghold for grouse for the last few decades. So I was hoping to hear that you had encountered a few more grouse than what you said, but maybe not in the right cover. Unfortunately, grouse numbers have been declining pretty steadily for a couple decades now, and are pretty poor. With a very few exceptions, our hunters are not encountering many rough grouse. Similar situation with quail. Scioto County would not have been a strong quail county in any recent years, nor pheasant. But as you said, you travel a little further north, you get into some quail country, and then even further north, you get into the pheasant range in Ohio. I'm sitting kind of right in the middle of Ohio's pheasant range, so that's one of my favorite pursuits. Although they're not as abundant as you'll find further in states further west, if you get on the right properties in central Ohio, you can have excellent wild pheasant hunts.
I had a family friend who he farm raised pheasants somewhere up north, and whatever he didn't sell at the end of the year, he would bring down to his father's farm, and probably, I don't know, 6 or 8 of us would get together and we'd go have breakfast. We'd let the birds out. It was funny because he'd grab them out of the pen and he'd spin them around and throw them in the air.
Yes.
So they'd go flying off in this cut off cornfield or wherever we hunted them. I can't remember. And we'd go in, eat breakfast, tell a lot of stories and some lies, and then we'd go back out and hunt them. And you're right, pheasant hunting is so much fun. What I know we're supposed to be talking about turkeys, but this is interesting to me. My grandpa always told me that pheasants didn't like the southern part of the state because they couldn't fly as well. So the soil would stick to their feet and it would make it harder for them to fly. Is there some truth to that?
I have heard that quite a bit. I actually did my master's work with Ohio State University, and I was in Highland and Adams County in southwestern Ohio. And I would hear that often. I would hear that about pheasant mostly, and I would occasionally hear it about quail. I am not aware of any truth to that. I've never seen it. I've never seen it documented. And in decades past, we had wild populations of those birds. So it's really more of a function of habitat, the habitat that you find in those counties. For pheasants specifically, they don't do well in heavily forested areas or even moderately forested areas. And if you look at the landscape of Ohio, the further east you go, the further south you go, the more heavily forested those counties become. And you reach a threshold there where it's unlikely you're going to have pheasants persist, wild pheasants, I should say, beyond those counties because of the forested habitat. The lack of grassland habitat, but then also that forested habitat is just not what they're designed to persist within. So I've prepared a slide. I have encountered that exactly what you said so many times. I kind of prepared a slide of our current pheasant range. This has been a number of years ago, so the range has probably changed a little bit. But I would fit it within a map of Ohio showing the forested area as well. And it's really neat that pheasant range kind of fits right into that forested area, into the gaps of that forested area, almost like a puzzle piece. So there's probably some other habitat factors going on there as well, but the primary one would be forest. If there's too much forest, you can't really expect pheasants to persist in that area.
And I guess while we're talking about habitat, it's worth bringing up with turkey. I've heard that good pheasant and quail habitat also kind of parallels good turkey habitat. Is that true for eastern turkeys, or is that something that's like a western turkey thing?
No, it can be true for easterns as well. I will say there's overlap, and it's not perfect. Not all, if you were to design a perfect landscape for Ohio quail, that's not going to fit turkeys exactly, and vice versa. But there is overlap. And an example I'll give you, when I was doing quail research, I would run pointing dogs pretty avidly to locate quail coveys, and we would use the dogs to actually capture the quail. Dogs would point the birds. We would capture the birds with nets while the dogs were pointing. And a big problem we ran into was in the spring when we were trying to capture these quail. We would be running in CRP fields, Conservation Reserve Program, waist high grasses and forbs, and quail would be out in those areas at that time of year. Well, what was also out in those areas at that time of year were nesting turkeys. And so we would occasionally have a dog point a nesting hen turkey. We would start to get nets ready, and then out would come this big wild turkey, which we were very glad to not get in our quail nets. But just an example of some overlap between those two species. They were both utilizing that specific habitat type at that time of year.
That sounds more like fun than work, if you ask me.
We do plenty of work, but yes, that part of it was very fun. On occasion, we get to do some things that are very much enjoyable. It's one of the reasons I ended up in this field. I've been very fortunate to be employed by the Division of Wildlife and to be able to get to do the things that I do. Yes.
Growing up in, the middle part of Ohio, obviously you've got a pretty deep history of being outdoors. You mentioned you didn't really start working for ODNR until what, about 10 years ago, you said? Or even more?
2012. So I
Okay.
finished up my master's work with Ohio State, and I was hired by the division actually at that time as my responsibilities were more as a pheasant and quail biologist. And then through some biologist musical chairs, I've ended up in the forest game bird position. And very happy to be working. So the species that I focus on primarily at present are wild turkey, ruffed grouse, and American woodcock.
Okay, so those are three very interesting birds.
They are.
Back to the grouse. Like I said, I've only ran into one, and I think that was enough for me because it scared the bejesus out of me. Two, I have a love-hate relationship with turkey. So I'll give you a little bit of background. I've told this story 1,000 times. I'm going to tell it 1,001. We would go hunting for them in high school every spring, every fall. Just so happened that we had some late starting days that occurred on spring and fall turkey season. So a buddy and me, we'd get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock every morning, trudge up to our hunting grounds, sit down, and start calling, and inevitably we'd hear gobble 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 gobble, just this big tom up on the hill, and we'd sit there and we'd get our blood all pumping, and then he'd hit a wall every stinking morning, and then we'd get up to go home and we'd see him run up the hill every time. So after 4 years of doing that, I swore him off. I said, heck with it, no more of these ridiculous birds. I can't get one. So that's my background with turkey. Now, that being said, it's still fun to hunt them. They're a great bird. I don't know. Like this year, I almost talked myself out of it. All winter, I said, I'm not hunting turkey. It's pointless. I'm not going to drop $35 on a tag. And then I got my NWTF magazine. I started looking through it, and I said, yeah, I'm going to go hunt turkey this year.
Yes, I understand. You're reminding me, for a long time, my friends and family tried to get me into golf. And golf was nothing but frustration for me. And I never understood how anyone could enjoy the sport. I can fully appreciate, I play a lot of other sports. I could appreciate that there are those that do. But it was nothing but frustration for me. And then I took up, as I got more into hunting, I started pursuing other species beyond small game I was accustomed to, and white-tailed deer, specifically Canada geese, and then wild turkey. And they were nothing but frustration for me. But the fun part of the hunts, when it wasn't extreme frustration, so much outweighed that frustration that I keep coming back every year. Now, admittedly, it would be less frustration if I were a better goose hunter and a better turkey hunter. But I've started to understand golf a little bit better. There's something to that the challenge and the frustration, and when things go right, the joy of having them go right far outweighs any of the frustration you experience.
Oh, absolutely. I can agree to that. Okay, so since you focus on turkey, I assume you know a little bit of the history of turkey in Ohio.
I do.
So let's talk briefly about their historic ranges and turkey numbers over the years. Starting 1900s or whenever up to current day.
Certainly. So some big events for wild turkey numbers prior to European settlement. The state of Ohio was completely forested, and we can go off on a tangent about what that forest was like and how many animals were there. There were different species that were there that were eventually extirpated with arrival of European settlers. But the biggest problem for wild turkey with the arrival of European settlers is those settlers cut down almost all of Ohio's forest for various purposes, principally for agriculture. So forest clearing, and then even the unglaciated areas of Ohio were converted to farmland. And that occurred through the 1800s, and really we reached our low point for forest cover in the late 1800s, early 1900s. At the same time, there was basically unregulated hunting of most species, including wild turkey. So by about 1904, we had our last observation of a wild turkey in the state of Ohio. They were, for all intents and purposes, considered extirpated from the state, gone from the state of Ohio. And they remained that way for several decades. In the 1940s and 1950s, the State Wildlife Agency, it wasn't called Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife at the time, but the predecessor to our agency, they made various efforts to restore wild turkey. And they, at that time, used domesticated or a semi-domesticated version of the wild turkey. Because that's what was available. And there was thought that, well, once we get them out, they'll return, their wild instincts will return, they'll do just fine, they'll populate these areas. That was not the case. There were a number of problems with domesticated birds. There remain a number of problems with domesticated birds, such as pheasant, quail, and other things. They simply don't have the instincts, the survival instincts or reproductive instincts that wild birds do. And so all those efforts with wild turkey failed in the 40s and 50s. And then in the late 1950s, the Division of Wildlife, or the state agency at the time, secured some agreements with other states that still had wild turkey populations. And the agreement was to get wild turkey moved to Ohio for release. And at that time, we'd actually had considerable reforestation in the state. So a lot of the southern farms and eastern farms that had kind of been carved into the Appalachian foothills and weren't great farmland to begin with, but were also subject to severe erosion and those things because they were hillside farms. They had started to grow back back into forest. So turkey habitat was improving considerably, as was grouse habitat, with those young forests all over eastern part of the state. So anyway, the state agency secured these agreements with other states. We got birds from a number of states, I think a dozen in total. And they included West Virginia, Kentucky. The majority of our birds came from Missouri, but there were birds from Florida and I believe Texas and a handful of other states. Some states sending only a half dozen birds, and other states sending, I think Missouri maybe sent 40 or 50 birds. Anyway, these birds were released in southeast Ohio, in the most forested area that the agency could find. It was thought, if these birds are going to do well, they're going to do well in heavily forested areas. That was their traditional habitat type. And it was really at that time thought those turkeys would never expand outside of southeast Ohio because the farmland was retained through most of western Ohio, and there wasn't much forest land. So it was thought, we're going to reintroduce these turkeys to southeast Ohio. They're not really going to expand, but we're going to have them here in the forested area. Those birds did tremendously well. They were very successful. They took right away. I think in all, we only moved about 150 birds from other states to reestablish Ohio's population. They did so well that after a few years, we began to take birds from the southeast population that was growing very rapidly, and we were moving them to new areas in the state of Ohio. So we would catch birds in southeast Ohio and move them to good forested areas in other parts of eastern and southern Ohio. Eventually, these birds started even moving into western Ohio in areas where, again, biologists did not think turkey would ever survive because there was so little forest land. And when we saw that the birds in those areas were doing well, we started moving more birds into western Ohio and even extreme northwest Ohio. Populations in those areas have never grown to the level that you'll find in eastern Ohio and southern Ohio in those heavily forested areas. But we now have turkey in all 88 counties of Ohio, and they seem to be doing very well. We reached probably our peak population level in the early 2000s, and we've sort of leveled off since that point. And we ebb and flow. You see the population numbers go up and down, largely associated with successful reproduction. So if you have really successful reproduction, the population bumps up a little bit. And if you have poor reproduction, population comes down a little bit. But all in all, we sort of have balanced out since the early 2000s.
Overall, was overhunting in the East a really big problem? I know it was for elk and black bear and things like that. But was that from the East Coast all the way into the Mississippi River? Was it really a big problem?
As I understand it, yes. Now, of course, during that time, you also have that considerable shift in habitat availability, like I described. So, can you say that overhunting and unregulated hunting was the primary problem? I don't know, but it contributed certainly to the loss of a lot of the species, like you mentioned, and species like the wild turkey.
Makes me feel really bad that our peak was in the early 2000s, because that's when I was hunting them hard and heavy. So,
yes.
Talk about Eastern turkey, I guess, in general, because I know they're different than the birds we have out here. These Rocky Mountain birds are tough. And I mean, they travel a lot. They act a little different. What are some things that kind of set an Eastern turkey apart from, say, a Merriam's or a Rio?
Yeah, certainly. So I will admit I am definitely not an expert on all the subspecies. Ohio only has the eastern bird. It's the only bird that I've ever worked on, the only subspecies that I've ever worked with, I should say.
Well, let me put your mind at ease. I'm not an expert on any of them, so.
Well, someone out there is an expert, and when they hear this, they're gonna say, "Oh, that Mark doesn't know what he's talking about." I hear the same things that you hear. I hear, or I've read. NWTF has some really good informational pages on turkey biology, life history, habitat, but they've also got a subspecies page that talks a little bit about the differences in subspecies. I mean, one of the first ones that's most obvious is the color differences that are subtle to some, but very obvious to others. The eastern turkeys got a little more brown color, a little darker than some of the other species. You see it on the tail fan in different areas. But the behavioral differences, like you're describing, I've heard that easterns are the loudest gobbling. I've heard there are differences in spur length and beard length, for the more of the trophy hunter. But the behavioral differences, I would imagine, come largely from the habitat that those birds live in. The eastern forest is very different from the habitat that you're describing, the mountains of Colorado. The birds are going to find resources in different areas and over different home ranges. I'm guessing your western birds have a much more expansive home range. They're moving probably a lot more than our eastern birds are in a really good deciduous forest habitat. So there's a difference there. Hunting birds that aren't as mobile is going to be very different. Not to mention, there's probably some considerable differences in hunting pressure in those two areas. I would imagine a much more densely populated eastern area gets a little more pressure, excluding, of course, our urban turkeys, which have their own set of problems, but probably a little more. Our eastern birds, I would imagine, are encountering hunters more often and maybe picking up on some cues more often that western birds just don't get because of the vast area and long ranges that they travel. I could be wrong there, but that would be my first. When I read about those behavioral differences from hunters, or I hear them, I think, that's likely what's going on there is some landscape differences. Where are their resources? How big's their home range? Do they need to travel? And how hard are they being pressured by hunters?
The one thing that really strikes me whenever I hike up in the mountains and go looking for turkey, coming from Ohio, in the southern part of Ohio, the heavily forested part of Ohio, I don't understand what these turkeys eat. Back there, I understand there's forage everywhere. Not to mention the farmland, corn,
Yes.
soybean fields. Those turkeys in South and Southeastern Ohio, that's the reason they don't move. To me, they don't have to, like you said.
Yes.
So as far as turkeys back in Ohio, what makes a really good habitat? What are they looking for that keeps them there? Obviously, you mentioned the heavily forested areas. Is it a certain type of forest?
Certainly, yes. And I guess the habitat question is difficult because when I think habitat, I'm often thinking at a much larger scale than the hunter or the landowner. And I say that because when I get questions about turkey habitat, it's very often what can I do on my property to improve things for wild turkey. And the biologist sort of needs to take a look at the bigger picture, what's around. Of course, I guess I should add to that, maybe in Colorado, you have some much larger, as you move west, it seems property size seems to be much, much larger than what we have in the East. So when I say landowner in Ohio, you may be talking 50 acres, 100 acres. There are certainly larger properties in Ohio, but often those are the size you're talking. So good turkey habitat, I often start at the township scale, which I recognize there are also differences here, Colorado and Ohio, between county and township size. But for Ohio, a township scale is a good one to look at. How much forest, period. I don't worry about forest type necessarily at that scale, but how much forest is within that township. And generally, that's going to put you in a range of really good turkey numbers, pretty good turkey numbers, poor turkey numbers, and so on. Just how much forest is in the township. And as you scale down, that's when you start to look at the things like you mentioned, food resources. What's the structure and composition of the forest? What are the species that make up that forest? Oak, as an example, is an excellent turkey resource. It's a food resource that gets them through the winter. Has a lot of other value for wildlife. So if you find forest stands that are heavy in oak, you're going to find turkey scratching there through the fall and winter, likely to be nearby at least when spring comes around. But it's not. I don't want to say that a solid forest stand is best, because it's not. You actually reach a point where the more forest you have, the better the turkey numbers are in Ohio. But up to a point, then it levels off, because actually those openings and in some cases the agricultural fields like you described are really beneficial to those birds. And we actually get some of our best turkey numbers in somewhat broken forest areas. So when you look at that township scale, you see a lot of forest. That's probably the primary cover type in those areas, but you see broken pastures, agricultural fields here and there. And those provide those turkey with openings for display and foraging. Brood areas, nesting areas, where mature forest maybe is not ideal. You've got better ground level cover where a hen can conceal a nest, and you've got vegetation at low levels where those poults are going to be able to pick insects and remain concealed from predators. So I guess the short answer to that is diversity is key. Everything in moderation. Some forest cover, but not too much. Some agricultural cover, but not too much. Herbaceous ground level, that nesting and brood rearing cover, but not too much. If that makes sense. That's about as vague as I can be.
No, that's great. I mean, you're right. The area I lived in was the Soda River bottoms area. So
Yes.
we had these, like you said, agricultural areas that adjoined forest areas.
Yes.
And a lot of times you'd see those birds. They'd come out, like you said, in those clearings, do their strutting and getting you all excited, and then they'd hop up into the woods and be gone.
Yeah.
So, man, I had a question. Crap. Oh, so that what you described there, the little pockets of dispersion, is that what's considered biomass? I came across that term in the NWTF magazine, and they really didn't describe it all that well.
Yeah. So typically, in the article that you mentioned, what I picture they're describing for biomass is the vegetative matter that accumulates in a forest stand, and it could be live, it could be dead. I think in that example they were referring to a lot of the dead accumulation of logs and so forth. Particularly, I think they referenced some of the litter left behind from a logging operation, where they might take, the good section of the trunk of a tree, and then there's quite a bit left behind. And in some cases, I saw in a later issue, there were some comments from readers that were positive in regard to that article, and one was from a reader from Michigan. And Michigan has some use for that accumulated biomass, I think, in some type of fuel source, pellets or something. But to get back to your question, they're talking about that accumulated vegetation, specifically wood, in forested areas, either just naturally accumulating or following management.
Okay. And I imagine those places are, to me, that'd be a good place for woodland birds, because it provides some type of cover. And
I'll fall back on that everything in moderation again, because you certainly can have too much. I don't know of any specific examples in Ohio. Some of the Western examples, which I think there were a lot of Western examples referenced in that article, that's where you get high fuel loads and potentially dangerous and damaging forest fires.
Yeah, we had that this last year.
Right. Yes. You would probably be much more familiar than I would. Ohio's blessed with sufficient rainfall that we don't have, is sometimes too much rainfall, but we don't have the forest fire issues that a lot of the Western states do. And at the same time, we don't have those accumulations, those large accumulations of fuel for forest fires. But I'll also say, for a variety of wildlife species, you're right. A little bit of that biomass, the accumulating debris, is valuable to game birds, grouse and turkeys and woodcock, but also a whole suite of other wildlife, insects, amphibians, and so forth. A lot of things rely on that decaying wood and structure. So a little bit of that is not a problem. So.
It's always odd to me to think about a turkey and other bird species that lay their eggs on the ground. Some bigger birds, will say like an eagle or something like that, they nest in trees. Why don't turkeys nest in trees?
Concealment is very important for wild turkey. There aren't many things brave enough to go and steal eagle eggs, but from a wild turkey, there are any number of predators, including avian predators. So you might think up in the tree that they would be more secure from some mammalian predators, but there are a number of avian predators, including things as small as crows, who will prey on wild turkey eggs. So, that's one of the reasons I think biologically turkeys just aren't well suited for construction of tree nests. But turkeys are ground nesting, as you mentioned, and concealment is key. The survival of that nest depends on the hen's ability to conceal it from all predators for a fairly long period of time. It's one of the reasons that fewer than half of nests are successful, is that hen has about a 2-week laying period, and then a roughly 28-day incubation period. So more than a month, she's got to keep that spot and those eggs concealed from all number of predators that are out on the landscape who would love to encounter that nest.
What's the success rate for the poults to make it to adulthood or breeding age?
Good question. We would be happy if roughly a third of our nests hatch. And then typically a successful nest, almost all of the eggs are going to hatch unless there was some problem with incubation. So roughly, on average, let's say 11 eggs successfully hatch from the nest. That hen, it will be fortunate if she's still got 3 of those poults by the time they're near adult size. So eggs, the success rate is lower than a lot of people realize. And then the survival rate for those poults is a lot lower than most realize. Just because she's, when you see that hen running around with those little fluff ball poults, the majority of those poults are not going to make it. And if she gets 3 of them to adult size, she's done really well.
Wow. So will say like an avian predator take out those poults as well as ground mammals?
Certainly, all of the above. Now, those turkey poults start to develop ability to fly at about 2 weeks. Pretty weak flight at that point, but by 3 weeks they're a little better at it, and that's one of the dangerous things for poults and hens at that stage is they've got to roost on the ground and are very susceptible to nocturnal predators at that time, mammalian and avian. But then once they're able to take flight, they can start roosting in trees like you're probably accustomed to adult turkeys doing. And at that point, they're fairly safe from the mammalian predators. Avian predators are still a problem, specifically great horned owls. A lot of people don't realize that owls are capable of taking even an adult turkey and do so quite often. But as I mentioned, once those poults are able to fly, the number of predators that can access them, specifically when they're roosting, is dramatically reduced.
Excuse me.
But prior to that, anything and everything will eat a turkey poult.
How have coyote numbers in Ohio affected turkey? Is there any kind of correlation? Because I know people are hot and heavy on coyotes, and here pretty soon we're going to be hot and heavy on wolves too. But that's another ball game. I'm not touching that.
Understood. I won't either. Coyote numbers are, I would say, strong in Ohio. They've been growing for a number of years, but I think they've leveled off recently. We don't see as much direct coyote. We don't see the evidence of as much direct coyote predation as most people think. They're often they have the finger pointed at them because for Ohio, pardon the phrase, but they are sort of the big bad wolf. They're the biggest mammalian predator. They take a lot of the blame for declines in game populations. And when you look at dietary studies, and I specifically focus on game birds, you don't see those birds show up too often in studies of coyote diet. It's a lot of small mammals, voles and mice, and small mammal, maybe some larger mammals like rabbits and so forth. We don't think they have as significant an impact on birds, specifically game birds, and certainly not the impact that most of the public think.
Earlier you mentioned urban turkey, and they have their own set of problems. Do you mind explaining that just a little bit? Because I'm sure everybody's seen the funny videos of turkeys attacking mailmen out in the streets.
Certainly.
Are those the kind of problems you're talking about?
They are. Those are certainly the problems that get the most press. Turkeys, very much like white-tailed deer, one of the reasons they have been so successful in recent decades is not only they can access and utilize a broad variety of habitats. They're what we would call a forest generalist, meaning they don't have a very specific habitat type that they require, like rough grouse do. But they will utilize a pretty broad array of forest habitat types, and that includes urban areas, urban parks. I'm sure many folks are familiar with or have seen wild turkey in parks and so forth, and that's often where they get into trouble, particularly in the spring. Gobblers get a little aggressive with anybody that comes or anything that comes near them. They'll attack cars. Often, I'm guessing they see their reflection in windows or in vehicles. and they'll attack that reflection. We actually had someone contact us from a museum in Northeast Ohio last year, and they had a large statue that had reflective metal over the front, and a turkey. They had one resident turkey that would not leave that statue alone because it saw another turkey, and basically at that time they're hardwired to establish dominance over other males in their area, and they cause a lot of problems in that way. And it's interesting. The postal carriers, I don't know if it's because they're out in so many areas and they're visiting so many properties that they encounter turkeys more often than the rest of us, or if there's something about postal carriers, either the turkey's head turns blue and red and white in the spring season. I don't know if it's the colors of the uniform or what it is. There's a lot of speculation about why postal carriers get so much attention from wild turkeys.
We're just adding on to my grief. They seem okay. They seem like such a stupid bird. They attack rubber dummies. They attack reflections, but they are so wily. When they're out in the woods, they're very wary.
Yes, you bring up a good point, and I've had this question before. How smart are turkeys? I hear, folks will say, "Well, I heard a hunter," or "I'm a hunter, and I got outsmarted by turkeys." How smart could they be? They are. I will not make the claim that they are intelligent birds. And certainly not at the level that you see crows and ravens and those sorts of things. But where they stand out is in their ability to survive. Their sense of eyesight and hearing are acute. They will notice any odd, anybody that's hunted turkeys knows, you've had that moment where you're convinced that turkey saw you blink your eye and took off running. When it comes to survival, they are very well tuned, and as you said, they're wily. But yeah, if they see their reflection, they'll fully believe it's another turkey, and they'll have at it.
I say they're wily, but there's also I don't know if it's a recent phenomenon or not, but the videos of guys that will hold up a fan, a turkey fan, and actually have turkeys come into them, and then they drop the fan and just shoot a turkey basically point blank.
Yes.
How good can their eyesight be if they can't see a human behind a turkey fan?
That's a very good point. And I guess the analogy I would make would be the bull and the red cape. There is that fan is a physical cue for those turkeys. Of course, that's why you see the display in the spring. They're erecting their feathers, they're strutting, they're displaying their tail feathers. It's a dominance display for other males, and it's an attractant to females. So the only thing without any background in behavioral science of animals, I'll just say, based on my observations, that must be a cue that is just absolutely enraging or fascinating, but it blinds that turkey to all surrounding danger. That turkey has cued in on a potential threat, and they've got tunnel vision. That's the only explanation I have, because I've seen the same sorts of things that you have. Is how does that turkey not realize there's no body associated with the fan? It's just a fan, or sometimes it is a body and a fan. How do they not pick up on that? That's the only explanation I have. Is they must be so focused on that fan that nothing else matters at that moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I suppose humans have some of the same cues. I'm probably not going to talk about them, but men get blinded by certain things, so why wouldn't a turkey, right?
I imagine so, yes.
What are the success rates for hunters for turkey? Spring or fall, doesn't really matter.
Certainly, yeah. Well, spring and fall are very different. A much higher success rate in Ohio in the spring season. It bounces around anywhere from 20% to 25%. So about a quarter of our permits are typically filled, and that's that is only our permitted hunters. And I say that because in Ohio, a landowner can legally hunt their own property without license or permit. So there's some number of landowners out there hunting turkey, and I don't know about it unless they shoot a turkey. And in Ohio, you are required to check a bird that you harvest.
Mm-hmm.
So we have landowners, of course, that check their birds, but I don't know how many are hunting. With permits, I know exactly how many permits have been issued, and I know how many have been filled. And so that's where we get our success rate. But in a good year, we'll exceed 25% of permits being filled. And it also depends on permit type. Residents are typically pretty successful, but actually our non-residents are usually a little bit more successful. And I don't know exactly why, but I would speculate if you're a non-resident coming to Ohio to hunt turkey, you've made an investment of time and money, and you're probably willing to put in a little bit extra effort to make sure you get that bird. So our non-resident success rates are typically a few points higher than our resident.
I could see that. In the days of COVID this past year, have you seen an uptick in the number of turkey permits that have been issued?
We have, yeah. That's been, in light of all the terrible things that have happened with this pandemic, of course, that has been a really interesting thing to watch. It's we presume, I can't say for sure, but the increased availability of some free time. I know certainly a lot of people that I work with and talk to, interact with, they've not had long commutes to the office recently, and work schedules have been very different. And in most cases, those folks have had a little more time to get out and do the things that they enjoy, hopefully doing so safely, social distancing and all those sorts of things. But we have seen both hunting licenses and turkey permits spike. So that's been encouraging, and specifically youth permits in Ohio increased by about 25%. They went, I think, from about 8,000 permits in 2019 to over 10,000 permits in 2020. So again, I hope that there will be some investigation of in light of declining hunter numbers, which has been a problem for decades, and declining interest in pursuing animals. And that's important because the Division of Wildlife is funded by, and our work is funded by the sales of hunting licenses and permits, and some other means. But I hope that somebody will investigate exactly what went on and what allowed for that spike in participation. More folks able to get out and enjoy the outdoors.
For what it's worth, my 2 cents. If you're looking for something new to do in the days of COVID, don't do turkey hunting. Any other kind of hunting's fine. Either that or crappie fishing, because you'll get mad and stop hunting altogether.
Now, yes, unless you have a little bit of luck on your side, and then I would say the danger is you may be hooked forever and unable to shake the habit.
I will say this, even though I've never been successful actually bagging a turkey, just being out there and hearing one gobble in response to one of your hen clucks, it will absolutely send your heart soaring. It's one of the best feelings in the world.
I agree. I did not start turkey hunting until I was in my early 20s. I was in grad school. And at that point, I had hunted a number of species. And it's not just hunting. I had been out just watching wildlife, observing different. I had the opportunity to see a lot of different wildlife species in various settings throughout the country, and internships and work that I had done. I have never had a moment as exciting as having a wild turkey sound off at short range like you described. It's absolutely, the hair on your neck and your arms will stand up, and you'll love every second of it, and you'll have no idea how many seconds have gone by. So even if you're not a hunter, if you're a photographer, if you just want to experience something like that in the woods, I would encourage people to try it. It's a real challenge, but it can be tremendously rewarding just to observe that spectacle.
Absolutely. Does Ohio have a mentor program for youth hunters?
So we don't have we have a few tools, I'll say, for mentor hunters and those that would like to hunt with a mentor. We have an apprentice license. So folks may know to obtain a hunting license, I think in most states, you've got to complete a hunter safety course, which can be a little bit time consuming. I think there are some online options now that have made it a little easier than when I was going through that course. But the apprentice license, as an example, does not require the hunter safety course, but it does require that you hunt with a licensed hunter that has completed the course, so that you are under the mentorship of that hunter. And then we have a number of lottery hunts and specific mentor and youth hunts in the state. You can find those details at wildohio.gov and various other places. But those are specific for either youth hunters or mentor-mentee hunts. And then within the Division of Wildlife, we're blessed to have an extremely active state National Wild Turkey Federation chapter, NWTF, and a number of really active county chapters. And many of those chapters not only have formal hunts for youth and mentors, meaning youth hunters, but then also potentially adult hunters who would like to get into or like to experience hunting. They have formal hunts that some of those occur on different dates outside the season, specific to those events, and then others that are more informal, just people who would really love the opportunity to take a new hunter or someone that's interested in the activity out on a hunt. And I would advise anybody, regardless of your experience level, to take any opportunity to go out with an experienced turkey hunter. You will learn something. I guarantee it. Even if you have an equivalent experience level to that person, there's going to be something they do that you hadn't considered, or that you hadn't tried, or that you didn't realize could be successful. And it's there's quite a learning curve with turkey hunting, learning the calling and learning the behavior and all the various things, and you can accomplish quite a bit on your own, but you will speed up that process considerably by going with an experienced turkey hunter and learning from them.
Yeah, and one of the things that, first of all, the hunter safety course, I think everybody should have to take that. I mean, it's such a critical tool. I was lucky enough to have a grandpa that taught me from the age of 4 years old up, the ins and outs of hunting. So we did the hunter safety course anyway, and by the time I got there, I knew everything they were talking about. I was fine with it. But there are also some inherent dangers with turkey hunting that I don't think a lot of people really think about. You're trying to disguise yourself as much as possible. And, there are stories out there, just like deer hunting, of hunters accidentally getting shot just because they're not seen. At least with deer hunting, you have hunter orange.
Yes. And in some states in past years, I don't know of any that have them currently. There were some hunter orange requirements for turkey season. I don't know that any states still have those. And it's for the reason you described. In past years, past decades, hunting incidents and accidents were fairly common to spring turkey hunting. Fortunately, through agency effort and just general better practices by hunters, those incidents are becoming more and more rare, but they still do occur. And we have a few in Ohio every once in a while. I would encourage hunters to recognize, just as you said, that you are often fully camouflaged. You should always assume there is somebody else out there with you and take necessary precautions. I often hear people say, well, I was hunting private land. There's nobody else allowed on there. There's nobody there. One of the more recent incidents we had was an incident where two hunters were hunting private land. They had permission to be there, and the hunter that accidentally shot them was not supposed to be there. And the two parties did not know of each other until the shot was fired. So certainly be safe. Use sound judgment with decoys. Think about not only what decoys you're putting out there. Is this a decoy that might attract a hunter? Would it be better to use a hen that's not a legal target, with no beard, I should say? Mm-hmm. Would it be better in certain circumstances, maybe on public land, not to use a decoy at all? Just make those considerations, or place the decoy as an example, in an open field where there's no way somebody could get downrange or get in the line of fire with you without you seeing them and being able to signal to them. Generally signaling to another hunter, we recommend you shout, verbalize your presence. Don't quietly wave your hand that might be mistaken for movement of a bird. And I know a lot of people are going to cringe at this. I often throw hunter orange in my vest, especially if I'm going to be on public land. I'll throw a hat and a orange vest in the pouch of my turkey vest. And if I'm up moving around, moving from spot to spot, I'll put that hat on and maybe even throw the vest over my shoulder. And then if I'm fortunate enough to take a bird, I'll drape that orange vest over the bird. So I'm not walking out of the woods with turkey feathers that somebody might mistake for a live bird moving through the woods. So,
or get attacked by another turkey.
Right. Yes. So I think there are a lot of practical measures that folks can take to make themselves safer, but it's something, you bring up a really good point. It's something you need to be aware of when you're in the turkey woods. Absolutely. Or even if you're out just during turkey season, mushroom hunters and so forth. I encountered a mushroom hunter a few years ago on public land in Ohio, and he was wearing a black T-shirt that had red, white, and blue writing on the front. Oh, and no other, he was quietly walking through the woods, and he had the exact colors of a wild turkey on his T-shirt. And fortunately, I heard his footsteps. I recognized them as human, and was well aware that a person was coming towards me and could safely announce my presence, and we could go our separate ways. But that was an example of a fairly poor choice to make, and just an added risk that person was taking, maybe unknowingly, during turkey season.
And that brings me to kind of one of the last things I really want to discuss real briefly, public land access. Out here in Colorado, there's a ton of public land. And you run into the same things you just mentioned. You run into other hunters. That's fine. It seems like in Ohio, there's not as much public land. Is ODNR doing anything to open up, say, farmland or anything like that for hunters?
Yes. So you bring up a good point. States vary greatly in the amount of public land. And it seems as you go west, those states have a much higher proportion of public land. Ohio's, we have national forest, we have state forest, we have wildlife areas. Wildlife areas are under the ownership and management of the Division of Wildlife, but they make up less than 10% of Ohio's total land area. And they're concentrated in Southeast Ohio and parts of Southwest Ohio, where large chunks of land are have been easier to purchase in past decades. So we have a decent amount of huntable public land in the state, but not nearly what you'll find in the western states. But to answer your question, and what is the department doing? The Department of Natural Resources. We've had a number of recent acquisitions. One of them I'm really excited about. It is the Appalachian Hills wildlife area, and it's land that was owned by AEP. It's a huge chunk of contiguous land, one of the largest I've heard of in the state, nearly 60,000 acres. And the department is in the process of purchasing that property, and it's already made acquisitions in recent years. One has become the Jesse Owens State Park and Wildlife Area. So that's a huntable area, and east central Ohio. Surrounding that was a new acquisition, which has been named the Appalachian Hills. I believe it's going to be wildlife area or state forest, but both are open to public hunting. So this will be when the purchase is complete, and this may be accessible land to hunters in 2021. This will be the largest piece of contiguous huntable public land in the state of Ohio. I believe more than 30,000 acres, which I understand in Colorado is maybe not huge, but for a state like Ohio, that is an extremely large piece of contiguous public land, and it's got trails and camping areas and so forth. So we're really excited to see what sort of opportunity that offers Ohio hunters. And then if you visit the department's website again, I would suggest looking for public wildlife areas, or state wildlife areas, state forest. Those are some of the best opportunities to find good turkey habitat in the state of Ohio that's open to public hunting.
Fantastic. So other than buying a hunting license and buying hunting gear, are there any other ways that Ohio residents can help out ODNR and keep the resources flowing?
Certainly. I mean, there are a number of other products that are available. We have a diversity stamp that goes to our diversity program on mostly our non-game species that sometimes don't see some of the revenue that's specifically tagged for game species. I mean, if you're an avid shooter, target shooter, or whatever the case might be, I think anybody that owns firearms or shoots recreationally outside of hunting should be aware there is a tax on hunting, on firearms and ammunition, the Pittman-Robertson tax, and that money is allocated to go to state wildlife agencies, and it's federal money that's distributed to all state wildlife agencies through a formula. So a portion of the money that you pay for those items goes to wildlife conservation. It has very specific requirements, but state agencies, I think in all states, I know Ohio does, accept donations through various means. There's specific license plates for wildlife conservation. You can check those, or when you when you register your vehicle and get new license plates. Tax checkoffs and so forth. I would encourage you just to check out wildohio.gov, and we've got some great resources on there on how you can support not only the agency, but the agency's efforts and partner organizations, NGOs and so forth.
And what's the easiest way to get a hold of someone at ODNR if they have any questions about hunting or fishing?
Yeah, certainly. I would recommend anybody. Go to wildohio.gov. We've got a contacts page there. It's got not only a contact, it's got a phone number, an email for general questions. It's got the contact information for all of our regional offices. It's also got a number to call for any potential violations which have been observed that would go directly to our law enforcement and our officers.
And my last little 2 cents is the last thing we'll put in there. For any hunters in Ohio, make sure that you make friends with your park rangers and ODNR officials. They're good people. They're out to make sure everybody's safe and following the laws to make sure that everyone has these resources available to them. So I think a lot of times you guys get a bad rap, but you're avid outdoors people just like the rest of us. You just want to make us safe.
I agree, and I appreciate that. Yeah, you certainly develop thick skin within the agency very quickly. But yes, the folks within the agency are as avid outdoorsmen and women and as dedicated to the resource as anybody that I've met.
Mark, I'm done talking about this stupid bird. I've had it. I've got my calls right here. I've been practicing, so.
Mine are up on top of the desk. Yes.
These Merriams are going to be so clucked at whenever season comes around. If there's anything that or if there's anyone else in the agency who wants to talk about any other specific animal, let them know. Give them my contact information. I'd love to talk to them.
Certainly. Yeah, it would be, I'm sure it would be their pleasure as it has been mine.
Mark, I appreciate it. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.